for inviting me to this platform and to speak to all of y'all. Whoever sees this presentation, I hope you find it meaningful and interesting. I'm going to be talking about the work that I have been doing for the last 9 years in an organization called Programa Vaca. My name is Juan Loyo. I'm an architect and a designer and artist here based in Mexico City, but really just roaming around my country and all over the world, trying to find interesting stuff to work in and to invest my lifetime in. So I started this organization like 9 years ago with the idea of trying to tackle how we approach design, and the business of architecture in general was something that I was worried about because it didn't reflect what I felt was what engaged me to design and just to the process of imagining a space and how those things operate, right? And so my idea was to find a new way or a different way, or to even recuperate a way of how we used to do things, and just insert changes here and there so that it could be a more organic type of methodologies and organization that would be inviting for people to join and to see design as a privilege and a place where you can generate a community or invigorate a community, and also just invite people to the joy of being able to transform our surroundings. And with that comes a big battle towards what I experienced in college, right? In the university, where it's all about competition, it's all about winning, and it's never about just summoning people into creating an environment where everybody can feel useful and can bring something to the table that is valuable, right? And in my case, I happen to be very talented at designing, which is by no how can I say this? Like, I didn't ask for it; it just happened to me. And so I found myself in the position of being, looked at as a threat or looked at as a competitor, and I never really liked that. And so I created Programa Vaca a couple of years after graduating from university, and I did a couple of projects that became famous, I guess. And so I grabbed this opportunity to create this NGO and just to rethink the way that I approach architecture, rethink the way that I share it, and create a team that could, actually put their hands on into building and solving and creating a methodology that would be super flexible, and so that we could test it in different contexts and from there get some results. And basically, Programa Vaca, what it is, it's a platform for community building. We use natural materials and traditional techniques, and it's about experimenting and investigating how these techniques can be put forth for solving habitability issues for communities that are surviving multidimensional poverty. In the case of Mexico and India, where we have worked with the organization, we have found many responses, some of them pre-planned, some of them we just sort of like, how can I say, like ran into them as we made them happen. And so it's an interesting process to just be able to go to a place, and then from the place and inside this time frame and these resources that we have, which are very limited, create something. And I think that speaks to the capacity of the imagination of everybody involved, not just me. So I guess that's the introduction.
Great, thank you. No, that gives a really good, really good background. I'm curious, what was the process of getting into architecture school? Sort of, how did you know that was something that you were interested in? And is it challenging for others, depending on where they're born in Mexico, to actually get into university and go through that system?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, because I didn't want to be an architect. I actually wanted to be an artist, and I all of my life I worked towards being an artist, and I still do art, and it's still part of who I am, I guess. And I guess that's why I never really fit in with the architect's prototype of what is an architect student should be look like or should be working toward, right? However, I stumbled into architecture just it just sort of happened. And I guess architecture was the second best thing to art. And I just went for it because I suddenly felt like I wanted to do it. I don't know. Like it really, at that age, in Mexico, we choose at 17, right? I was 16 at the time when I chose architecture. So you can imagine all sorts of crazy things that were happening in my head. It made sense at the time. And I discovered quickly that it wasn't what I really liked, but something about design and just imagining and being able to create space was still very enticing to me and very interesting, even if approached as an art form, which I think is an art form. In the case of Mexico, it's absolutely a privilege to be able to attend the university, and it's absolutely a privilege to be able to gain access to a place of higher education like the architecture schools that are here. And I went to a private school, so you can imagine that's even a higher privilege. And I quickly found myself again not really liking my surroundings in private school. Architecture in the generation that I come from was very much about big buildings and concrete and steel and glass and all these industrialized materials, and I never really felt connected to that. Luckily, I was able to find myself in a place where great people were also asking the same questions. Teachers who accommodated to my craziness, I guess, and they just allowed me to explore the ideas that I was interested in, and I was particularly interested in soil and earth-based building. And this was not part of the curriculum when I was studying, and they sort of like made it fit into the architecture program, and here I am. And so I'm very, very grateful for people who are able to sort of like look at somebody's potential and just sort of like accommodate. And I think when we're teaching, because I've done teaching as well, it's important to be able to recognize the opportunities to open new paths for people and to be open to helping people find these little spaces that aren't necessarily looked at when these programs are created, and basically that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely across the board in almost all architecture programs, I definitely think there's some perceptions about earth-based materials or even natural building that's sort of somehow lesser than or not of a high like design quality. And a lot of the projects are these sort of like big glass boxes or just these crazy projects. And there is this sort of like perception of kind of categorizing that as somehow lesser than this sort of like higher ideal. But it's great that you were able to kind of push that forward and incorporate that into your design education. Great. So yeah, I would love to, jump into your presentation and learn more about the program and yourself.
So I'm going to be talking about Programa Vaca, which is this NGO that I just introduced a couple of minutes ago. And basically, Programa Vaca is a platform for community-based building, which focuses on regional materials and the use of vernacular techniques through a participatory, pluralist, and gender-sensible methodology at the service of vulnerable human groups. And we basically use community building as a space for teaching and learning from sustainable building. And with it, we are trying to share the knowledge, but also incorporate other knowledges that are around there and basically live in every territory because they have been part of their history and their vernacular expression of architecture, and just sort of like mesh them together and create solutions that can be put forth as options for the people in real time, okay? And so throughout these 9 years, we have tackled many aspects of what we think our work sort of touches. But I'm going to be talking about 4 in particular. The first one is housing poverty, which I think through some pictures and I hope I can explain a little bit of the context and the reality of the families and communities that live surviving multidimensional poverty in Mexico and rural areas and indigenous territories, also a project in India. The second one is the loss of vernacular architectural techniques. So we trying to bring back or sort of like not lose, because in Mexico, these techniques are still alive somehow, or there's still reminiscence of them in the communities, but just sort of like bring them into the spotlight again, and sort of like understand their value again and their immense possibilities. The third one is assistential dependency, which is a big issue in Mexico and probably everywhere, but big issue in Latin America as well, where we have been sort of like educated upon a way solve all of the issues and whatnot, but because of the economical realities, the political realities in our territories, this is very harmful and also not happening. So in that case, we created this organization to try and become self-sufficient and sort of like create a response from the base instead of waiting for these assistential programs to come and help the people, right? And the fourth, and this is a very important aspect of it for me at least, is the gender discrimination in the building process. So these are only four of many other things that we sort of encounter in the work that we do. In the end, our built habitat is representative of so many aspects and so many nuances and so many little things that are still there. We in no way are trying to say, oh, we're solving the whole poverty issue with what we do, but housing is a big important chunk of that. And also we're trying or we assess these things not as buildings, but as processes where people are invited to participate and learn things and also reinforce their own capacities. And so I'm going to be talking about some projects that we have done over the years. And in the last part of the presentation, I will be focusing on our last project in Oaxaca. And all of these projects have happened in different communities and in different states and different regions. So all of them are trying to express or find a solution particular to their context. In our case, we focused in the beginning mostly to working with women. The reason for this is because due to migration, most of these communities are vastly inhabited by women, children, and the elderly people. And somehow they have not been regarded as capable of building. Also, the industrialized materials have been a big part of pushing away people from engaging in this collective activities. And so we based our methodology in the beginning into working with women because, well, those were the adults that were inhabiting these spaces and these territories, and they were also very eager to participate. It's important to note that we're not just randomly showing up at a place and saying, hey, who wants to build? There's a big process of discerning what the project is, of choosing the communities that we're going to be working with. And most of them have other projects, productive projects that had already been happening in the territory for quite some years. And we work hand in hand with other organizations who have a presence in the territory, not in the building aspect of it, but in other issues like human rights or textile production or organic production of food, stuff like that. And so I wanted to show this slide because to me it's very important to show you that the women and the people who are participating in this have an active voice in the design, but also an active participation in every aspect of the building, which allows us to transfer completely the knowledge of this building to them in order to see what happens after we leave. All of these projects happen in a very short span of time. Say a month and a half to 4 months, the longest time that we have been in a community. And so it's important for us to sort of like pass on all of the knowledge and then keep looking at what happens to a building after we leave, because that's actually the big impact that we can have is when people appropriate these buildings. So one of the things that we try is for the empowerment and the collective capacities reinforcement. As I said before, I don't think it's about an individual sort of telling everybody how to do things. and just like coming up with an idea and imposing it in a community. I think the idea of what we're trying to do is to get together, and with everybody's capacities and flaws, we can find ways of working that aren't necessarily what we would expect or what we know to be how people build, right? Or how things should be done. And so this methodology allows us to be very inclusive and to incorporate all sorts of capacities into the process. Um, it's important for us to say also that we don't come to a place with a pre-drawn project. Actually, there's no blueprints. There aren't any computers involved in the whole process. There's no renderings, nothing like that. So it's all, paper and conversations, because not all of us have the same tools to communicate, right? And so blueprints would actually push people away, because in a way, blueprints and the way that we're taught to think about and express architecture is a particular language that is very restrictive and it's not inviting to others. And so all of our buildings are drawn in this insight and sort of discovered as we go along through the process. Active participation is an important aspect of it. It's for us, it's a way to break that assistentialism, is for people to actively engage in this thing, because we're not going to put all of this energy and all of these resources, as limited as they are, into just doing housing for the people and as a romantic idea of what social architecture is, but actually asking people to join the process and to be an active part of that. And so, as I always say to all of my friends in these communities, you're not going to pay me in money, you're not going to pay back in money, but you're going to pay back in sweat for sure. And so everybody is sort of like invited to this process, and they slowly, sometimes faster, sometimes a little bit slower, engage in it and find themselves capable of crossing the line of imagining themselves as capable of engaging in building. For us, it's also very important, the appropriation and a sense of belonging from these buildings. That this is what actually ensures the survival of the project in the long run. And I think once you put an effort, a physical effort into the building, it becomes a part of your story. It becomes a part of what you worked for, and the achievement of the building is also a big reinforcement on the self-perceived value of how you were a part of this story and of this project happening. And so it's important for us, for people to engage with it, bit by bit. And when it's finished, it becomes a big how do I say this? A big stepstone in their own story, right? So we do an active research for sustainable techniques. Most of these techniques, as I have said, already existed in the territories that we work in, but we introduced some modifications. Some of them imported from other territories, some of them new ideas that we're experimenting with. And they basically have a lot to do with structurally bettering the conditions of the building so that it can survive for a longer periods of time, but also that it can be safer. One of the big issues with earth building in general is that people tend to believe that it's not as strong as concrete or steel, and this is absolute falsehood. Natural materials have existed since men and women started building things, and they're actually filled with amazing stuff that can be preserved over the years, which is not a thing that happens with concrete, for example. No, we think of concrete architecture and industrialized materials architecture as infinite, but it's actually very finite, because at some point it's just gonna decompose and it's not gonna be able to hold itself. Whereas natural materials have the capacity, particularly with raw soil, have the capacity to be transformed and to be maintained in time, and also have a lesser impact in the environment. Even if the buildings get out of use, you can still leave these buildings, and if they dissolve into the ground, then no big consequences are going to happen there, right? And so it's an active research. And what we're trying to do is to teach volunteers and also the communities little tricks and things to fully understand how these materials work, why they work. And so it's a constant process of explaining, but also of touching these elements with your own hands and fully understanding their potential. And so it happens a lot that a lot of people will come to the buildings and say, "Oh, this is gonna fall. This is not. You're not gonna be. This wall is just gonna fall if I kick it, right?" And so I always encourage people to kick our buildings, because then they're gonna see how hard they are. And this is actually part of how men start engaging in the process of building after they see women working with us, right? And so men find themselves in the beginning very reluctant to participate, and they'll be very cynical, right? They'll say, "Oh, these things are gonna fall. You should do it with concrete," all these things, right? And then after they start seeing these things come up, and these are the probably the biggest and most beautiful buildings in the communities, um, they start to like feel like they should be a part of it. And then in the last part of the project, usually have some men engage with it. Anyway, and also it's important for us to create architecture from its context. So as you can see with the projects, we're not repeating a system, and we're not repeating a project in all the territories. It's not a model, and I don't believe in models actually. And so each building is supposed to express what the community is about, what its own story is about, and the particular conditions of the plot that they're in. And so it's very interesting to be able to create architecture as a form of a sculpture almost, and sort of discovering little things that you can change and modifications to a project that can happen just because you are there every single day. And you can see the way that light enters the building, or the way that each or how the building interacts with its environment. And I think that's a delicious process, and I think it's probably the best way to find the aesthetics and the full beauty of each space, and to sort of like help it realize it and be a part of the building. And also design as a process of the detonating imagination in other people. So we have had the privilege to be able to study architecture, but also to create architecture, right? And this is about imagination. It's always about imagination. And with our process, what we're trying to do is to invite people again to be a part of it, and to expand their their world. And so it's great to see how people have had ideas, or can have ideas that are brilliant, and because of their particular conditions, they haven't been able to explore that, or it's not allowed for them. And this process all of a sudden allows everybody to express themselves, and everybody to even find these little things. And say, for example, I put forth an idea like the glass, I don't know how to say celosía, sorry, central picture up there, brise-soleil. So like the glass brise-soleil that we have there, it's made of recycled, or actually tossed away glass, and I sort of like put this idea in the wall for women, and they took it, and they sort of like started doing their own, right? And so it's a great feeling to be able to just put a little spark of an idea and just see where it develops. And also it's important for us in terms of volunteers who come and work with us and alongside us in these projects, to be able to build together and to expand our understanding of other realities. So in any other place, or without this experience, we would still be thinking of poverty in terms of, I don't know, income, of whatever ideas we think poverty is. And also from the community's point of view, they would still think of us in this way that we can't understand, right? But when we come together and we break that barrier, there's something in that interaction that dissolves what we think we know of each other, and it allows for social transformation, which in the end is what we're looking for with the excuse of architecture. And also beauty as a core value. So we don't think of projects as, like square meters and you need to solve these issues and that's it. We try to bring these architectures to life in how they interact and the conditions that they create for a space to be beautiful and meaningful and an artistic expression in the end of what happened there at the particular moment. Do you want me to pause or have a question there? Because then I'm going to start getting technical.
No, this is great. I was curious about the sustainability research techniques aspect. When we were in Guatemala, when I was in Guatemala, we did a research project on different types of bajarake and traditional building techniques. And we did find that there was an increased cost in the the sustainability techniques that required more materials. So if you had to go to the gather rocks, for instance, that had a cost to it. So I was curious with that research, if you did incorporate cost of either gathering the materials and any of those kind of factors with the research.
Yeah, absolutely. So every single aspect, every like liter of gasoline that we had to use for gathering earth or stones or whatever is accounted for. But it's also very interesting that you touch base on something that is very important to me, which is we think of traditional techniques, which also touches base on the romanticization of indigenous cultures. We think of these techniques as something that can't change, right? And so bajareke, for example, is not it's not one of my favorite techniques, by the way, because it's not as resistant as others, and also because it incorporates a lot of wood. And wood, at least in Mexico, is more and more scarce because of the overexploitation of it, right? And so if we were to just rescue these techniques just as they were used, we would not be responding to the contemporary issues that we have at hand, which is, for example, wood is no longer available, right? And so we try to also bring other techniques and modifications to the structure so that we can use less of these materials that are more and more scarce and that can bring the cost up, right? Because wood, in most communities, you'd have to somehow buy, or at least part of it buy, whereas soil is accessible freely because it's part of most communities' rights to have soil, right? I'll touch base on that a little bit after in one of our projects. I think you're going to find that very interesting. And so, yes, we do take into account every single thing that comes into play in order to be able to create this project. So, for example, one of our big expenses is actually food. And we don't pay for labor, for example. We've never paid for labor and we would never will. And so the way that we do this is, so we invite people to the project, and all of the families and the community who participate they have food that is provided by us, right? So we provide the food, we provide the materials, and we provide the tools and our time. And so with bringing the solution of food, actually, you open up a space for people to invest their time in the project without having to pay them to participate, right? Because it wouldn't make any sense for us to pay somebody to build their own house. That would be assistentialist. And also we would find, as many other projects have, a lot of problems in the way, because in the end, it becomes a way of subsistence and it's counterproductive to the process, because then you want to slow it subconsciously or consciously. So you want to slow it down so you have an income for a longer time, right? And so when money is off the table, it just becomes about something completely different. And so food has been the way for us to be able to create the conditions for people to participate and invest their time and their family's time in it, because their immediate needs are being solved. And in the end, either their clinic or their community center or their house is going to be built. So in, say, 4 months, for example, in the case of housing, you're going to be able to have a house, right? And it only took for you these 4 months instead of years and years and years of, trying and save and paying your loans and all these things, right? I'd also want to note in these two charts here on the left, you're going to see women in yellow, men in this dark blue, children in green, and diversity in orange, right? And so these are the identities of people who participate in our projects historically. And so it's, for us at least, it's very interesting for everybody to see that most of the people who participate are not men, who are regarded as the people who should be building or are capable of building, right? And on the right, you're going to see how much experience, sorry, did people have prior to the project, right? And so the experts, that would be us, it's only 9% of the project, and most people had never built anything in their lives before. So I'm just gonna scroll through some of the projects that we have created. This is in Amatenango del Valle, this is in Chiapas. This is a community centered. We also built 4 family kitchens that are also part of a productive project. And this was created with, I believe, 13 women and ourselves. And it's a 16.5 meter long building, 4.5 meters tall. So it's a pretty big building. And it's very noticeable in the community. And it was very interesting for them to achieve this. This is a project that we did in India. Each house cost us $600. It's a very small house that is flood resistant. And this came after, in 2015, there was a big flood in Chennai that completely erased the little possessions that this community had. This is called Londor community. And they are part of the cast of the Untouchables. And so they weren't allowed to have access to education, to jobs, to health, or any kind of security. And the only thing that they had is a couple of, plastic tents or something like that, or very, very precarious housing. And when the flood came, it just took it all away. And so we were working with another organization based in the Netherlands. And we created this in 3 months using only local materials, and we worked with the families, which was very interesting because we didn't even speak the same language. I spoke a little bit of Hindi because I worked with Balkrishna Doshi back in 2007 and 2008. But this is South India, so they speak Tamil, and it's almost frowned upon to speak Hindi. So we didn't have language as a part of our common communication. And so it was very interesting to find solutions using other ways of communicating. This is the community center for the Wirrárica community in La Cebolleta. This is an indigenous community from the Wirraritari. This is, you'll see some pictures later on. This is in Jalisco. And this was built in a month and a half. And it's 155 square meters. And we built the adobes and everything from scratch for this project. And this, for example, project I really like because it includes a cinema. And so in this tiny community up in a mountain, there's this, I guess, theater that people can go to. And we realized in the diagnostic process that movies was something that the communities were really, really interested in. And before we did the interviews and we sort of like invited everybody to the meetings and all of this stuff, but we didn't understand the volume of the community until we projected a movie. And it was, I think it was a Japanese animation movie or something like that. And you would see people just flocking and sort of like gather around the projector and the piece of cloth that we put in our truck, right? And so we immediately understood that the cinema was part of how we could reinvigorate and give life to this community center, which includes a traditional medicinal clinic, a workshop, and a store. And it's interesting because what has happened is that other communities from around the area, this is the smallest community and the poorest community of this whole area. They gather for their cinema. I think it's Fridays or something like that. And women started making popcorn, and they charge, I think it's 3 pesos, so less than a quarter, to watch the movie. And with this money, they started buying the stuff that they need for their workshop. This is another project that we did in Chamula. Now, if you say Chamula in Mexico, everybody's gonna understand the political implications of this. But probably in the US is not as known. Chamula has been a very interesting territory who they have fought fiercely for their independence from the central government, right? And there's a lot of machismo also in this community. So people were very worried for me and the queer community that comes along in building in this context, right? They several times they told me, Juan, they're just gonna kill you. But alas, that didn't happen. And it's also part of that social transformation. When you come into these communities with the intention of actually serving the community, and these buildings are a testament to that, then the community protects you and they see you as something that is valuable. This has happened to me in all of the projects. In the end, most people come to me and they'll say, you know, most people come here to take something from our community. If it's either pictures or our artwork or our products or the experience, they always take something from us. And with our organization, you actually leave something there that is useful for the community. And so I think that's very valuable. Do you want to do another round of questions before I start the last project?
No, this is great. It's really highlighting also this aspect of really physically working with your hands as well, which I think is just another added benefit of all these projects. But yeah, no, this has been great.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about real quick Santiago Niltepec. This is in el Istmo de Tehuantepec. This is the south part of Oaxaca, which is like the southern part of Mexico. And this territory has a lot of particularities. And I think it's culturally very, very rich and very interesting to work there. It's also very hot and very humid. And after 2017, there were a series of earthquakes that hit Mexico. This was the epicenter of where the earthquakes began. And so you can imagine the destruction. 85% of the buildings in this community were either severely damaged or completely destroyed by this earthquake. And so the grade of affectation that we saw when we first got there was devastating. People quickly started gathering their belongings and sort of like putting themselves up in these little plastic tents and, you know, like self-made precarious housing. And there was this outrage in Mexico in general for a solution, right? And most of the solutions came from the central government, which, you know, usually is industrialized materials, big corporations doing the buildings, and also it was an electoral year, so you can imagine the importance of creating a show around this issue, right? And so what happened is that as we sort of like pieced together the project, did the whole diagnostics, tried to gather the resources and whatnot, these projects started to happen. And so one of the big issues that we found is that yes, many buildings were destroyed, but the ones that were still standing mostly were natural buildings and the traditional housing in El Istmo de Tehuantepec, this particular area. But these companies would come and they would convince people to pull them down and to destroy them in order to be able to be eligible for this new housing that was going to happen, and these new houses that they were going to give out for free. And so a lot of the architecture, how do I say this in English? Traditional, sorry, my Spanish is kicking in. Anyway, the traditional architecture.
Yeah, you can say it in Spanish too.
Oh, okay. The traditional architecture was lost, not because of the earthquake, but because of the destruction that came afterward. And there are many cases that I could tell you about where I visited the families and we would think of ways to just, you know, sort of like replaster some of the building, but it was beautiful and it was still standing. And a couple of months after, it would be gone. And it would be replaced with a very low quality construction that was not even climate appropriate. And then they ended up it was poorly built and it was just terrible. And most people ended up using it more as storage than as housing, or had to invest more money into trying to fix the problems that this little tiny house had. In comparison, this housing that was built by the government was 36 square meters in average, and our housing is 73 square meters in average, and almost half the cost per square meter. I'll talk about it later on. But anyway, so this is what we found when we came to El Istmo de Tehuantepec. It was heavily destroyed and people were desperate for solutions. And we quickly tried to gather the resources for it, and we ended up working with 4 families to create these housing. Everybody was invited, but a lot of people didn't want to participate because they didn't want to do the effort, because all these free houses were being put forth as a possibility, and also because of this assistentalist tradition, no. The government will provide and they'll come with a solution, and we just have to wait and give our votes to whoever is promising these things. So we started working with these families that were sort of like left out because of their beliefs or because of the level of their poverty. And so we were really working with the families that were most affected by this earthquake, and that were socially outcasts because of particular conditions and particular beliefs or religious or political association. And anyway, so the project that we did changed the traditional way of building, which was bajareque, and we started using cob technique, a modified cob technique, because of the issue of wood. In the traditional buildings in Tehuantepec, you'd see big columns of wood that they sometimes span up to 9 to 12 meters long, and they were very thick, like 60 centimeters thick, right? These elements are no longer available. They're impossible to find, or they would be incredibly expensive to even bring in. And so what we try and do is to work with the most common piece of wood that they would have, which is 2.5 meters to 3 meters long, and it's a very small section. And so the idea was to use a structure that didn't need these wooden posts, that would have a monolithic wall, so that it would be able to resist best the earthquakes, right? And the way that it's done is basically fibers, which you can see there in the grass that grows there. You can cut it and then mix it with the soil, and then with that create this amorphous blocks, and then it's similar to adobe, but it's a faster technique in the sense that you don't have to wait for it to dry. It dries as you're placing it. And so to create this peripheral growing and then monolithic walls to be able to have a very strong house. We also incorporated foundations, which is one of the things that we incorporate in all of our projects that are not common in traditional expression for architecture. Foundations have been the biggest improve in terms of structure that we have put forth in these projects.
Do you use rocks for foundations?
Rocks. Also, it's important for us to note that we don't use any concrete. All of this is lime plastering and stucco.
Yeah.
And so we really don't use any of these industrialized materials, because it would be kind of silly to do it, right? Yeah. And so we use stones that we can gather around the community. Some of them reused, some of them are just there. Some of them were gifts. Like, we just really scatter around and try and find everything that we're going to be working with.
I was curious, is there any bamboo available in any of these regions? Not
here. Bamboo is more common in the region of Veracruz. We're actually doing a project with that later on, so big news to come, I guess. But no, bamboo is not it's not traditional in these areas. It's mostly this grass and these woods and the soil. They have incredible soil in Oaxaca. There's a lot of clay in this soil, and it's fantastic. And also, it's important to note that we incorporate people into the diagnostics of their own soil so that they can understand what soil is best for building, right? It's not all soil that you can just use, just grab any soil from your garden and start building. You need to understand the soil to be able to figure out the best way to build, right? And I mean, the picture isn't here, but what we did with this project is that we created two roofings. So a smaller roofing in the inside with clay slab, so a soil slab in between, and then a second roofing that separated the heat from the interior of the house. And these houses have been very energy efficient, and they're very comfortable to live in because they're protected that way. I think there's a picture where you're going to be able to see this. So I wanted to touch base on the labor and design materials that you asked in the beginning. And so as you can see, we don't pay any labor. All of this is community labor and volunteers who come and want to work with these communities, and also their own families or the groups of women or the communities that we're going to be working with, right? And so it's important for us to change the methodology of how we build in order to be able to accommodate to the physical needs of the people who are going to be working with us, right? And so you would usually use, for example, in industrialized construction, it's very usual for people to be like carrying all these blocks and just like grabbing whatever they can and just like using all their physical strength to bring all these blocks to the site. And it's very exhausting, I guess. It's like peaks of energy, right? And what we're trying to do is imitate more how women work, which is in these communities traditionally. Of course, there are exceptions, which is a constant incremental pace, right? And so we would use hand by hand, like one person gives it to another, and then that person gives it to another, and sort of like creating this ambience where we help each other instead of individually attacking this particular task at hand, right? And the other thing that we do is that we rotate the activities every single day so that everybody gets to experiment everybody's experience, right? And so it's very easy for people who are not doing the physical job to say, oh, you should do this or you should do that, right? It's very common, and that creates a lot of frustration. But when you have been in the shoes of others, then it's very hard for you to just come out and criticize somebody else's work because you have been in their shoes and you know how sweaty you get after doing this, right? And also, what we did is that all of the families in this project helped everybody. So all of the families worked with each other. And so we'd rotate for each house every 2 days in order for the material to dry up in order so that it would be able to resist the next peripheral growing of the walls, right? So it's a constant, how do I say, rotation of people in these buildings. And what happens is that slowly the project becomes a whole, and it's everybody's project instead of my house, you know, and they're just people just focusing on their house, but it's how do we finish everybody's house. And so by separating these levels of building, what we do is that it's not, oh, we build one house and then we go to the other. We're building all of them together so that everybody can reach the goal at the same time.
Has that avoided some tensions just with who gets a new house, who's involved, and are there still those issues that are sort of hard to avoid?
I mean, in the beginning, yes, like people, you know, the fastest way to bring something down is with the mouth, right? So everybody criticizes, everybody has something to say, but in the end, it's an open invitation, and it's very clear since the beginning how we're going to work and why we do it this way. And they see us work with them, which is an important way of bringing those criticisms down and just those issues down, the human issues, which are a big part of this project, these projects in general. So after we have invited everybody and we have explained how we're going to be building, a lot of people said no. A lot of people just ran away and they said, I'm not going to do this, right? And
Mhm.
so the people who stayed were they had a very big conviction of wanting to participate. And it was actually women who sort of convinced their husbands and their partners and their families to join, because they saw this as an opportunity. They recognized it, and they knew that it was going to be hard. Um, and so, but they still wanted to invest in it, and they felt like this was their opportunity for getting their house.
That's really interesting. So you're actually starting from a place of a conversation, so everyone could kind of be on the same page, and then sort of work from there and build out the project. Yeah, that's a very
Exactly.
different way of typically working, which is almost like an arbitrary, okay, we're selecting you for so and so reasons, and then everyone else like looks around like, wait, why did Aunt Marie
Once
get
they get it,
chosen and not me?
and not me. Yeah. Well, yeah, that happens. And the thing is, like, in the end, it's by decantation. It sort of happens very naturally through these conversations. When I tell them, "Oh, you're going to be sweating and you're going to be working with us, and it's going to be fun, but it's going to be hard," then a lot of people who don't either recognize themselves as capable, or do not really have that urgency to participate, then they sort of, like, like, they move away. Now there are cases where people who we thought were going to be very interested and that these projects would be very impactful in their lives, people still said no. Families of 18 who were living under just a plastic roofing, and still you can't force anybody into working with this. It's important for us to recognize that as even if we think we hold truth and that we can bring all this goodness to people, it's up to the people to choose that this is an important and valuable opportunity that is being presented. And I would love for people to just join and be enthusiastic enough to understand it, but it's not always the case. So you have to work with the most fertile soil, I guess, for this. And so, yeah, in the end, there's a lot of tension in the beginning because of these gossipings and whatnot, and people are very, they're all eyes, and everybody can see every single thing that you do in these communities. Everybody knows, right? So everybody knows you, and everybody is like sort of like side-eyeing whatever's happening, and they're sort of like critical of it. And like, we actually had a neighbor to this particular family who she would just yell at them from the like the plot right next to them, yell at them, "Oh, this is not gonna work, you're just wasting your time." And it was just an envious person who was sort of like seeing that this was happening, and all this joy that was being poured into these plots, because there's music here, there's a lot of joking. You need to figure out a way to keep energies high, right? And she couldn't find a way to engage and to participate. And so it's very usual for humans to go to the dark side, right? So it was Berta, who you see right there smiling with her children, was very proud of her house, and she never yelled back to the neighbor, but is very proud of her house, and keeps it very clean, in part because she wanted to show her neighbor that she was able to do this. In the end, I mean, there's a lot of stories here, and you can imagine. But in the end, what happened is that a lot of people who rejected the project in the beginning have approached us to say, "Hey, I want to build my house like this. How do we make this happen? When are you coming back?" Right? In a tiny 3,000 people community, it usually you would be able to walk 20 minutes from end to end to the of the community. It now takes me 4 hours, because every single step I get stopped by people asking questions and sort of like telling me that they want to participate or that they love the house. Um, and these families have come from being outcasts to being something that the community is actually very proud of, and they visit, and a lot of people just knock on their doors and they just want to see the project and they want to experience it, and they are able to explain every single step of the process and everything in the project because they built them themselves. And so I think the outcome that I am most proud of in these projects is not only being able to create projects that are very cheap, they're very cost effective, the impacts are very high, I think the architecture is beautiful and it's all natural. But the most important thing, I think, is the social transformation that we were able to achieve with it. And not us, but the community all together. And that brings me to the end of the slideshow. And I just wanted
Great.
to invite everybody to understand that architecture is a privilege and it's an opportunity to share with a community, to reinforce the way that we are linked together, and to understand the ecosystem of human experience. And in the end, it doesn't have to be social architecture. It doesn't have to be a project like ours, but every single time that you find yourself in the position of choosing a material, a process, or a set of people to work with, be conscious of the great opportunity that you have to bring work, to bring back to life materials, techniques, or things, or just ways of working. So we find ourselves in a very privileged position. Use it the best that you can, and that's all.
Great. Thank you so much. That was, just so helpful in thinking about all the challenges surrounding this methodology, and also just how many layered opportunities there are. It seems like your approach is, on one hand, like super practical, right? It's like we can come in here, we can really have a positive impact. And then there's all these additional layered positive attributes that kind of grow from what I think of as like a very practical approach. And then there's also these additional ideas. I did want to dig in a little bit more about the housing situation. Do you think a potential solution for that would be to like set up some kind of like center, like a building center program, or that you could somehow have like maybe the first people that did that house sort of help the next family redo a house? Maybe that's not their role. Maybe then they would need to be paid for a service like that. But I'm curious how you think of just training more broadly. If you could build up like almost a sort of secondary education system that's not privileged, that's really like working in the community to build out these projects.
I think that's an amazing question, and one that faces us every single day. Scalability, right? How do we keep these things happening? How would we expand it? One of the things that has happened is that, particularly with women, we have seen that plasterings is something that they have reproduced, not only in their own homes, but they have helped other women do plasterings in their house, natural plasterings. Also, in the case of some communities, some of the men have replicated our techniques in other places, and they have charged for it, and that's fine, as workforce. And so we have seen little expressions of these knowledge being expanded autonomously. However, we have also seen a lot of people who are volunteers who are creating their own projects and just creating their little communities and their little ways of orbing, ways of using this knowledge and put it forward. So our big bet on scalability is actually that, just sort of like helping people find their own strength to create these new projects, and just scaling by creating this mesh of things that are happening. But also, I think what you're describing is one of our goals as a project for housing, which is to create a system where people can participate and it becomes a little bit more autonomous, but it also involves a bigger scale of involvement from the community. So it's not only for families, it needs to be way more than that, right? And we are working toward that. Also, as a side of how these projects are evolving, we are going to be creating a school for, how do you say this in Spanish? So a school for people to join and just learn these techniques, more technique-based rather than project-based in a particular area. And so what we're trying to do is create a school where you can acquire the knowledge of how to do plasterings, or how to do woodwork, or how to work with soil, or how to do foundations individually, rather than having a whole project being built. That's more kind of like an educational project rather than a social architecture projects. You know? So yeah, all of these things are happening sort of at once. One of the things that is important to me is that we keep the scale of the organization small, because I want it to be very agile. I want it to be very cost efficient, but also because that's the way Juan, like to work, right? And
Yeah.
so right now we're only 4 people, and all of the things that you have seen have been created by 4 people at its core. And so I think that also shows a different way of an organization. We don't have to be, the humongous machineries, like it doesn't have to be so impersonal. Everybody has to be fully involved in the process, because otherwise you can't really relate that much to the experience and to putting forth all of the energy that it takes to be able to be doing this day to day, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so what do you think about, so a lot of these students will be doing projects most likely in the States, and choosing a project site that's in their location, in their community, and they'll be identifying a problem, and then through this site that they'll be working on, they'll be proposing some sort of solution. So I was curious if you just had any, you have a very particular methodology. I wouldn't even say particular, but a certain methodology that typically results in some kind of like ecological design solution. So I'm just trying to think like a little bit more broadly in terms of like, maybe you don't necessarily know that that's for this project, they wouldn't know that that's the solution in this particular situation. I'm curious, like if you have recommendations on how to think through the problems, and then sort of matching what your expertise is and what you can bring to the table, and kind of help propose a meaningful solution. If that makes sense. A lot of rambling words.
No. It makes a lot of sense, actually. Yeah, one of the things that can you still hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Something changed in my hearing. Uh, Actually, that's one of the things that I have been speaking about with other people. And how do you bring this to the United States? Just the economical and aspect of it is completely different. Socially, it's completely different. The way that their territory is managed is completely different, right? But I think there are a lot of similarities and a lot of things that can be used. And the whole point of this methodology is to be very organic and to be able to just change and shift. And so the first thing that I would say is there are things that you can incorporate of this process, because in the end, it's just a human-based way of organizing decisions. So in the end, it doesn't matter if you have to put, in the end, do blueprints. The point is how these blueprints are being informed by the things that you want them to be informed by. And so the first thing is imagine or think of yourself as an architect or a designer as a facilitator, and not as somebody who's holding, like the position of just saying what's going to happen. So when you find yourself in the position of being a facilitator, you're going to be able, I think, in my experience at least, to imagine much better things, and just to be able to keep all these factors that are going to be being shot at you, and just incorporate them into your process, incorporate them into what you're going to be imagining. Because if you come with a preconceived idea, it's going to be reductive, and it's not going to be good, because it's not going to be an expression of who is going to be inhabiting that thing and what's going to happen in that place. And it's not, and it might end up being abandoned, and that's not what you want with your work. I think the second part of it, being able to erase that preconceived idea of a project. Try to resist drawing before you know the project. Try to resist thinking, oh, I'm this architect and my signature thing that I do is this or that. It needs to look like Saha's thing, or it needs to look like Bjarke Engel's thing. It doesn't need to look like anything but what it needs to be. And in the end, because you are there, the expression of your individuality will come through. It's going to be different for each and every single one of you. You will be reflected in this project, because in the end, it's your life's work. It's the time that you're investing in it. So don't be worried about that, but try and just incorporate all the things that you weren't thinking of, because you're just one person. And in the end, everybody around you is going to be able to feed into your brain all these things, and it's going to be a better solution. And the third is, don't be afraid of using your instinct and your sensibilities to approach the situations. So the methodologies in the end are going to depend very importantly in who you are and how you communicate. So if you are shy, and if you are, you're really good at, I don't know, like math or graphs or drawing, use that to approach the project. You don't have to be what is, like conceived as a leader. You are a leader on your own accord, and by the beat of your own drum, sort of a thing. And just channel your capacities, channel your individual talents, and find a way to communicate and to weave yourself into gaining the respect for the position that you're going to be occupying. It's important for people to give you this space, and it's important for you to understand that this space has to be gained, but it also that it's because of your particular capacities that you are there. So trust yourself, but also be open to understanding the organization of how and where you fit.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And it does shift that typical mindset of an architect, which sort of puts the architect as a position of power, saying, okay, we're going to provide you this thing, versus like what you're really outlining, it, at least it sounds like, is really that they're just as much as part of the process. It's more about the process. And I love that word that you use, is the facilitator, facilitating this. Because certainly there are certain expertise that you can offer, and certainly, have this certain education that can be beneficial. So anyways, thank you so much. This has been so helpful. I have like a million different questions, but additional questions, but I think this has been really good for now. And I hope we can keep the conversation going in the future.
Sure. Yeah. Well, whenever you need anything or any conversation, we still have problematic tendencies. We still have social and political and economical impacts. We still have all of these things. In the end, this is a very complex theme. It's such a complex place. It's such a complex problematic. We could talk forever, right?
Yeah.